get started now. So maybe we'll begin some small talk here, but please feed us some questions. I think there were some questions that came from, that Kelly had emailed me earlier. So let me take a look and see what questions came up, or maybe there were some additional questions that might have come up that.
I would also say the session for me closed before I could type out all of my answers. So if there are any questions that I didn't get answered that come up, I'm happy to answer those. I wasn't purposely not answering, it just got closed.
Yeah. Got a question about COVID here. So it looks like this is in the comment section. Comment on COVID and AMN and prognosis for boys or for boys and AMN. Okay, so Troy, do you want to field what are your thoughts on COVID? I mean, you're sort of assessing this in the setting of transplant. Do you have any general thoughts on?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that people with ALD, AMN are more susceptible to COVID. I certainly worry about the adrenal insufficiency should they get the infection. And so I've been asking families to follow the CDC guidelines. And then, I get a lot of questions about school and following their school guidelines as well. But it's the endocrine part that worries me the most if one were to get an infection, not that they are more likely to get an infection.
Molly, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, so I would say in terms of adrenal insufficiency, with autoimmune adrenal insufficiency, it's known that there is like a slightly higher risk, not necessarily COVID. There are no reports yet of COVID, but just of worse infections with things like influenza. And so it's presumed that potentially with COVID, it could be worse as well. For ALD, it's a little different because it's not autoimmune in nature, but certainly anyone who's had a transplant, I would consider higher risk for a worse COVID response. But the most important thing would be managing the adrenal insufficiency early on. I haven't had anyone with ALD in my practice with COVID, but I've had other children with adrenal insufficiency and COVID, and they've been managed well with just stress dosing of hydrocortisone.
We have ALD Connect, a group of us put together a statement on ALD and COVID. And so I just put that in the comment section, so you can link to that there. It's nice and to the point. And we had a long-winded one up there before, and I see we've tailored it to a short-winded one. That's good.
The prognosis for boys who underwent transplant to develop AMN later in life. Yeah. This comes up very commonly. I don't know that transplant protects you from AMN. It's a bit of a different process, it seems to me. There is a case report out there from the Dutch group of some boys that underwent transplant and supposedly developed AMN later, but I don't know that transplant is protective. Keith often has probably a similar experience, or Florian has a similar experience when we've talked about it.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good summation. It doesn't. No convincing data that it's protective yet, though we're still kind of early to declare.
I think the trouble is there's the confounders are it's some of the toxicity from chemotherapy that has been used past decades, contributing here to some of the long-term sequelae. And now that transplant is getting better, are we going to see this over time to the same degree? So it's a difficult thing to analyze, but I agree that as a community we should be trying to tackle some of these harder questions.
We have a question from Taylor Kane. Let's see. So, do you ever foresee pre-pregnancy expanded carrier screening as something which becomes more commonly utilized and maybe even as a preferred option to ALD newborn screening? I have a kind of a longer thought on this, but does anyone want to take pre-pregnancy? So like a future where, where routinely people kind of like in the, maybe the, in the Ashkenazi Jewish population where they're routinely screened for Tay-Sachs, where people just generally go in for screening for genetic diseases as a general rule for family planning. How far away did, anybody want to comment on that version of the future?
I think, Keith, as you said, right, we don't really have a population like the Ashkenazi Jewish population where that would make sense. So I think on that first pass level, it does not make sense. I think this is a very individual question, whether within families, individual women want to, go through that process. So I don't foresee that becoming anything universal in the future. That would be my take. But
I might add to that a little bit and say that in the not just, obviously we wouldn't be doing it only for ALD, but if one were to go in and say, listen, we know so much about the genome and we know relative risk of certain genes, and or we can, and we, let's say 30 years from now, and there are enough genes that we would not want to bring in, into a child in some way. It's not too hard to imagine where that becomes something that some increasing number of people are doing, where they're getting just genetic screening for a wide range of disorders. I'm stepping out kind of on the popular level now with like 23andMe, where people are just sending their genomes in and getting genotyped and getting some feedback. And so maybe in the distant future, but I don't think it's in the near future. That seems some number of years away. There's a question here about what are the immediate next steps for adult male after diagnosed with cerebral ALD progression? That's a really good question. And how many hospitals are doing adult male BMT? This is one of the really important kind of underserved areas. Florian and Troy, you both do transplant in adults at your centers. Do you want to comment on some of the parameters there?
Troy, go ahead.
Oh, sure. Well, the immediate next steps for a man with cerebral disease is, contact an experienced center for sure. You'll want to identify. You want to be evaluated by somebody who can so-called stage your disease, because not everybody is eligible for bone marrow transplant. And after that, you certainly want to undergo HLA typing and start a kind of a pre-transplant workup if that's what's decided upon. There are not very many centers, just a handful, less than 4 that I'm aware of, that are doing adult transplants for cerebral disease. They're typically not, it's not an easy type of transplant to do. Adults carry a lot of risk factors. And the adult disease, I would say, is a bit different than the childhood disease. And I'll let Florian comment on it.
Sure. And I think there's, over the past decade, been a lot of data also emerging from Europe. And just to give the groups in Germany and France some credit on putting together some of the insights on what are differences, as Troy pointed out. We know that having concurrent AMN and having evidence thereof on also an MRI and maybe cerebellar disease might be a risk factor for not doing so well in transplant. The other point to maybe make is that our transplant center tends to be hesitant about performing transplants above age 60. And so we recently went through an evaluation of a patient above 60. And I think there are good reasons to start rethinking, different phases of life. And we also want to, adjust our MRI recommendations accordingly. So there's right now an international consensus process happening around some of the, at least the imaging evaluation for this. So it's an evolving field, as Troy mentioned. You're on mute, Keith.
The question, sorry, my kids are crying in the background, so I'm trying to block out reality here for everyone else. There's a question here for Troy and Molly. So does the finding of ACTH and sort of VEGF activities or just brain permeability suggest that keeping adrenal insufficiency under control and ACTH within normal limits may have an effect on preventing cerebral ALD? Just want to comment on that?
Yes, certainly we've linked this pathway together in vitro and in patients. But I have to say the disease is just far more complicated to be able to say, well, it's just ACTH. That's all there is to it. I think having good early control of adrenal insufficiencies, a good thing to do anyway. But is it going to prevent cerebral disease? I don't know the answer today, but I know I will have the answer in 5 years. Right? Because we're going to have the answer to this question because of all the state screening. So we'll know that whether the rate of cerebral disease changes, because I assume everyone's going to have endocrinology follow-up. Insufficiency is going to be addressed way earlier than it used to be. I will not be seeing kids with an ACTH of 3,000 anymore. So I think we'll have the answer in 5 years. That's my opinion.
So I just want to caution, if you have controlled adrenal insufficiency, that you still require your annual MRIs. And we've had boys who've gone through terrible cerebral ALD and have had stone cold normal adrenal function. So unfortunately, I think it's hard, to really make predictions from one organ system to the other. In our experience, at least, in doing a review in the Netherlands and in the US over a few decades, is that the two do not track. So as I think Dr. Lund said, there might be some pathophysiology upon the endothelial cells that's very interesting, but you can't be reassured just because your adrenal function is normal that you won't get cerebral disease.
Yeah, I agree. A couple of my patients come to mind who really had bad cerebral disease, but perfect adrenal glands. So like I said in my talk, there's always a caveat in this disease. There's always a patient who who goes against what you're thinking. So yeah, I agree with what you said.
I would also just caution in terms of ACTH under control, that having a normal, I think there was a question during my session about normalizing ACTH, and it's considered standard not to fully normalize ACTH levels in children, because if you do, you cause Cushing's syndrome in them. So it's over treatment to have the ACTH completely normal or even low. So I think we need to figure out more and understand more about the pathophysiology before we make any recommendations about how the ACTH should look.
Thanks. I do think it's true that no one will argue with careful control, and so I think making sure you're taking it seriously, and the doctors. But I think those are great comments and a piece of caution. I think that's great. Thank you.
Replacement is important. I just wouldn't use ACTH as the only marker for how well controlled a child.
Absolutely. Question about Min-102 approval. So this is the drug that's just finished clinical trials from Minarex. And Florian, you were really involved in helping with this trial. Do you want to comment on timing here for or outcomes of the trial and when that might lead to approval if it's successful?
Yeah. So I think Uwe Maya from Minarex actually spoke yesterday in the industry panel about it. It's been successfully completed as a trial, but the analysis is still pending, and we hope that before the end of the year we'll have that. And we do have joint sessions to start looking at the clean data by the end of the month. So I'm hoping that there'll be some news where we can give further recommendations by the end of the year.
And some questions here about future therapies in general and some over-the-counter therapies. We had we will have the so we had a nice conversation yesterday during the industry talks. But for those of you who are interested in the future of ALD therapies, that's a really good one to watch. It'll be recorded and should be posted on our ALD Connect website. So if you're wondering about future therapies, that's really kind of your best look at what's likely to be, at least in trials in the next few years. Whether it makes it through trials is a different variable, but I would recommend visiting that. I think we can comment in general about some of the kinds of therapies that are coming into you know, from industry partners. There are therapies that target ABCD1 like molecules. Those are a few companies with those where they're basically trying to reduce very long chain fatty acids through alternate means. There are some that have sort of antioxidant and anti-inflammatory properties based off of pioglitazone. And there are a couple molecules in that realm. And then we have some stem cell therapies and gene therapies. And I think the more different kinds of therapies we have available, kind of coming into our ecosystem, the better it is. So we think probably for the community to have more, hedge your bets in different directions. Any other comments from anybody in our group here?
Yeah. We're getting so many questions that we probably would need a few days to go through. But let me just say to some of the gene therapy questions, first off, it really depends on what you're treating. And if you're treating, brain inflammation, and we understand both from bone marrow transplant and ex vivo gene therapy, there has to be active evidence of inflammation and blood-brain barrier disruption. So doing that earlier than that lesion is apparent does not make any sense. There are some gene therapy modalities that are being developed for spinal cord that, if they can be done safely, they might lead to treatment without brain lesions in adults. But we don't foresee any gene therapy being employed in children before there is a cerebral lesion apparent. We hope that yeah, sorry, go ahead, Troy.
Oh, well, there's just, it's, gene therapy, or standard transplant, the conditioning is identical. It's, large doses of busulfan and fludarabine. And if a boy doesn't have cerebral disease, it's probably not something you want to put a boy through and risk toxicity from it.
So good question here. Go ahead, Florian.
Some of the modalities that you mentioned, Keith, right? Upregulating ABCD2, looking at other ways that you might compensate for ABCD1 could really be helpful if we can avoid some of the toxicities that Troy mentioned. But the question is, in what cell types, at what time, and how can this be done safely? So, time will tell.
There's a nice question here about any plans for including young adult females with ALD in research to study the progression of the disease in women.
So to be clear, women don't develop progressive brain disease. So I would say we always do an MRI in women we diagnose with ALD, just to have a clean baseline. But if there is an abnormality on the brain that is causing symptoms, we make sure to think about other things apart from ALD. So often one can become so ALD-centric to think everything's about ALD. It is not. So you can have an adulthood like other people's strokes. You can have other reasons for lesions in the brain. So we do have multiple studies going on in women with ALD, and I also think in Europe, Wolfgang Köhler and others are starting various studies to help address women with ALD, Mark Engelen in Amsterdam as well. So there is, I think, a lot of movement in understanding pain, discomfort, and then the gait and balance problems in women.
Right, and to follow up on that, so right, this person's asking about progression, and the progression is essentially similar to the progressions we see in AMN, with a slower course and some perhaps somewhat more nuanced features like movement disorders, as Dr. Sharma and Dr. Eichler have identified. But I think that it's a great question that has gone underserved for too long. And if you're interested in, so if any women are interested in enrolling in natural history studies, want to comment on that, Florian?
Sure, and so you can just contact me and I'll be glad to put you in touch with some of the researchers who are working on that. Okay. To just be clear and echo what other people have already said, women don't develop brain disease if we're just having one copy of the ABCD1 mutation. They also do not develop adrenal insufficiency. The disease that happens in women is predominantly one of a myelopathy, meaning a spinal cord disease, and there might be some subtle movement disorders that we're describing now, but these are not progressive in the sense of life-threatening, shortening, or disabling.
There's a question about how long the risk of graft versus host disease lasts after transplant.
Oh yeah, I did see that. It had to do with the risk at 20 years post-transplant. I'd say there's no risk at that point. Generally, the acute GVHD risk is within 100 days or so. Chronic GVHD risk, usually you have to have acute first, not all the time, is within the first year or so. After that, the risk becomes almost zero. So no, that far out, you don't have to worry about it.
Maybe I think, Keith, could we bring Josh into this and just ask Josh about, having so many questions on new drug developments in the field of ALD and AMN. You've, over the past decade, been able to bring a zebrafish model into the field. And I know you're helping multiple companies with new drug developments. Can you speak in broad terms about possibilities here?
Great question, Florian. I think that it's really promising that there's so many companies at the point of having drugs that they are trying to prepare for approval filing. So basically trying to show that their drug has safety and efficacy across different models, which is usually like the step right before they'll take it into a clinical trial. And so we've worked with one company in the past and then a couple of companies currently, which just seems like the pipeline is no longer just a trickle, but more of a stream. So the more shots on goal, the better the chance of something kind of coming through and being like really working. So I think that's like until we have something, we always are still waiting, but it's just makes you feel pretty hopeful for the future.
Josh, want to comment on how long it takes from a kind of a new drug discovery, like let's say chloroquine or something? How long does it take for something like that to make it into even a clinical trial or FDA approval?
It seems to take forever. I mean, I think there's been several, maybe not so much for ALD so much, but for a couple other diseases we've worked with where it's like the scene from Monty Python where you can see the people charging across the field, and it's the same scene over and over again where they're like half a mile away and then suddenly they're in your face. So it does seem like from the time a drug is in the preclinical trial testing, meaning they're still testing in the model systems, to the time where suddenly it's at the point of being tried in people, that you're looking at like a 2 to 4 year time window. It depends a little bit on the drug. If it's a known compound that's been used in people before, or a known mechanism of action that's been used in people before, then it's faster. But for a lot of the more novel drugs, that there's more safety information that's needed, which really kind of slows the ability to move it into clinical use.
Yeah. It is like the saying, we overestimate our future or near-term progress and underestimate the long-term progress.
Yeah, if I make one more point about that, I think for these diseases, we the whole community is probably aware of this, but we face the challenge that that the disease progression is kind of, other than cerebral ALD, in which the disease progression is too fast, for AMN, the disease progression is almost too slow, which means you have to wait a long time. It's hard to see the change over for a drug trial. Like you have to wait a year or two to really know, is your drug having a market effect or not, which makes it difficult for drug companies to kind of deal with waiting that long. It's more expense and more time on their part.
There's a question here about what can patients do to move research forward?
Well, I think there's I think one part is just being part of this community of ALD Connect and reaching out to other patients and families. I think that's a very important kind of community effect that has a certain momentum that helps move things forward. I think that the efforts to help the political world understand the impact of disease on patients and families is hard to underestimate. So I think that the more folks can do to let their politicians know, to let the large funding agencies know, makes an impact. Things like the National Institutes of Health, are how funding is controlled for all the researchers and folks that you see on these panels. And it really is a major limiter in the field. I think private donations, I've rarely heard of folks turning down donations to individual labs. I think that's always a way to try and help. And so I think there's many different ways to try and help move things forward.
Yeah, I'll echo Josh's words. I think we're not doing enough in the ALD field to lobby at Congress and also get NIH to come up with requests for proposals specifically for peroxisomal diseases. That's, compared to the field of lysosomal diseases, we're definitely seeing, too few RFPs on. So I think advocacy could go a long way for that. And that might be a goal for the next 10 years, is to really try to increase the RFPs. And
yeah, I can remember a conference, I think it was a conference where I first met Florian, possibly, a Society for Neurosciences, and the National Institutes of Health, NIH, which is the big funding agency, had a booth there where they kind of try and meet up and coming scientists, as well as kind of explain their field or explain what funding they have available. I said, oh, I'm working in leukodystrophies. And they're like, leuko what? So that was a bad sign, I figured at the time. I think they're better now, but it was not a good prognostic sign to have them asking what a leukodystrophy is.
Good you were not deterred, Josh.
Well, I got to meet you, and I was like, oh, I got to keep going. So, if this is who our future is, then we need some help too.
Exactly.
I've heard from maybe there are one other thing here to how you can help research is actually enroll in natural history studies, which are maybe they're not the most exciting thing for participants because they require paperwork and some blood work, but they really are foundational to understanding what is needed in the field in terms of therapies. There were some other questions in the list here of what are the best outcome measures for trials. It was a very sophisticated question about how to run a trial with the best chance of success and how to pick the right outcome measures. And, that's a question that we don't have as good an answer to as we'd like, in part because our natural history studies they're just never as detailed as we would want them to be, and the more information we have, and the larger and more detailed our registries, the better we are. So running those studies requires both funding and participants, and the funding supplies infrastructure and clinical coordinators and the PIs. And so there is some infrastructure funding available that some of our centers are funded with, that I think could be very helpful. But we are always looking for participants, and that includes our patient portal online. So if you can join the patient portal, fill out data about yourself, your family, that's very helpful. And I would also reiterate, fundraising for ALD Connect or individual, pick your passion project for labs or research or something you want to fund. That's a great way to make a difference. And then reach out to your legislator. I think don't underestimate the power of a letter in writing to your local legislator. I've been told by many people in public office that they really do read those and they take those seriously.
Keith, there's a question here on testosterone monitoring.
I saw a couple of those. Molly, do you want to comment on those?
Sure. I did put it in the chat. So testosterone in general is a controversial topic in endocrinology. What I would say is that it's probably, you shouldn't just be looking at testosterone levels. It should also include looking at gonadotropins and looking at symptoms when making a decision whether or not to treat. But I do think that it absolutely should be monitored. How frequently is not so clear. The studies that have been reported are all pretty much from the 90s, which is when testosterone assays were definitely very different than they are today. So I'm always a little cautious with one level. I would say that it has to be multiple levels plus symptoms before considering treatment, and also looking for symptoms. And symptoms include looking at bone density, as well as reports of sexual dysfunction, which I would say is really important for men with AMN to mention to their doctors and to have that discussion, because I think it's really important for quality of life too. And it's hard sometimes to talk about, but important to bring up.
There was, so maybe two follow-ups to that, Molly, is when should anyone be looking for at a testosterone level? So I guess I can imagine if I were a parent, I might wonder if my 5-year-old or something needed a testosterone level checked, or my teenager or something like that.
Yes.
So we're talking about adults here, right?
Yeah, I would say primarily adults, maybe the very late adolescents, but hopefully they should be plugged in with a pediatric endocrinologist who's monitoring their pubertal development. If for some reason pubertal development stalls, that might be an indication, but my experience has been that most of my patients have sufficient levels that they don't require any therapy in the pediatric, like even my young adult, older adolescent group, but certainly it's possible that it could come up earlier.
And Molly, I don't know if you got to meet Dr. Ramirez yesterday. She spoke briefly about hypogonadism, but just a little plug that she's starting a study looking at hypogonadism in the first year of life as mini puberty, and then in adulthood. And she would also appreciate your guidance. So it'd be great to have you on board.
I would be happy to talk to her. I'm sorry, I was absent for most of yesterday. It just, work-life balance is a little tricky these days, but yeah, I'm happy to talk to her. And interesting to think about it from an early age. It's interesting. Let's see.
With newborn screening, we now have opportunities. Yeah.
Yes.
There was a good question about that probably is relevant to plenty of people and it's a very personal topic about men who are experiencing sexual dysfunction. who should they reach out to, and what kind of therapies might be available?
So definitely I would suggest reaching out to their endocrinologist first. The first thing I think would need to be assessed would be gonadal function, because that I can appreciate that AMN, I'm not a I'm looking at a bunch of neurologists. AMN certainly can affect sexual function as well from a neurologic standpoint, but you would want to replace any testosterone if it really is low. So I think that speaking to the endocrinologist first would make sense, but really should be an open discussion with any physician you have to make sure that there's not something else contributing. Certainly mental health can contribute as well too.
Yes, and just to add to that, erection problems are not uncommon with men with AMN, and there are many men who seek counseling and also advice on medications for that.
I find that with the young adults, they don't bring it up to me. I have to bring it up to them, but it's definitely been reported to me. I actually have not found testosterone levels to be so low. I think it's more the AMN contributing in the patients I have, but it doesn't mean that testosterone can't.
Some questions about enrolling in studies. And so I think to enroll in natural history studies, you can email any of the investigators here. I think right now, I think Dr. Eichler and Dr. Fatimi have a funded natural history study through our GLIA RDCRN funding. So I might suggest touching base with Dr. Eichler, Dr. Fatimi about enrolling in that, particularly if you're an adult man or woman. My earbuds are dying here. You hear me okay?
Yes, now we can.
Yeah, now we can.
Otherwise, some questions about devices. How about medical devices that are coming into the foray for balance or gait? Any thoughts on future, any devices in the pipeline or future for medical devices? Mentioned here to a particular device called the Bioness.
Yeah. So here we lean heavily on our physiatry colleagues in rehab. So there's definitely a lot of progress in that field, with devices becoming lighter and sturdier and more personalized to patients. So I think it's always, if you haven't seen a physiatrist or thought about this in the past 5 or 10 years, it's good to revisit this, because there's a lot of progress in the field here. And a lot of patients do find that after years of not finding the right device, they can find it, but it has to happen with a good physiatrist and very close engagement.
Great. So we're often focused on preventing neurologic complications when we're talking about them. Molly, do you want to comment on the potential for preventing adrenal dysfunction or recovering adrenal function? You know, we have talked about a lot about brain stem cells, but how about, adrenal stem cells or other kinds of fanciful things? Anything?
So I will say the endocrine world, because we have therapies for most of our hormones, we tend not to look so much at prevention, but at treatment. So I would say the studies that have been done at the neurologic treatments, things like Lorenzo's oil and transplants, have not proven to reverse adrenal insufficiency or really prevent it, maybe slow the progression possibly, but not prevent. There are some studies looking at different types of hydrocortisone products out there, like longer acting hydrocortisones. There are studies looking at hydrocortisone given subcutaneously through pumps. those are all definitely research studies at this point, and not specific to ALD, but just adrenal insufficiency in general.
Someone asking here about I think about life as an ALD specialist, and what is the most rewarding part of your job and what is the most challenging?
Go for it, Keith.
Well, I think most of us would agree the rewarding part is seeing progress happen in real time for patients and families, and whether it's a successful treatment or or simply being present for a difficult time and being a support in that way. I think all of us, I think it goes without saying that all of us who are here enjoy these meetings and meeting with families. Challenging part is I think the frustration that all of us feel with the relative slowness of progress, and also the pain of loss that we feel as physicians too when our patients and families are suffering. I'll leave this open to any others who want to comment on that.
I couldn't have said it better, Keith.
Well said.
Remyelination therapies, this kind of falls in your wheelhouse, Josh. What do you think about remyelination therapies and the future for them, and here or elsewhere?
So I feel like every 3 to 6 months, I open a journal article in a major journal, and there's a new remyelination drug or way to kind of do that, but it's never made it into a clinical trial. So I feel like there's some major, I feel like there's some major technical hurdle that still exists that we don't understand before we can be expecting to see something like that clinically useful. So, I mean, that change could happen very quickly. Like it could be a couple of years, maybe there'll be a sudden breakthrough, but I feel like we want to be pretty cautious about hoping for a remyelination therapy. I think there's a lot of, there's some unscrupulous, scientists and physicians out in the world who promote various things that, are kind of miracle cures, they sound like miracle cures. And I think that we're all desperate and wish we had something like that, but really no one's trying to hide any kind of, thing that would be helpful for remyelination and for treatment. And so the folks that you're hearing from this weekend, if there was something, you'd be hearing about it for sure from the experts here.
Yeah, I think it's one of the complexities too is the remyelination assumes that everything else is working just fine, perhaps, and it seems, I think particularly for ALD, it's more complex than that. For disorders like multiple sclerosis, where we're talking about perhaps slightly more isolated demyelination, it's a little simpler. For ALD, it's going straight for the biochemical disturbances, or maybe for the inflammation, something like that. Those seem like the best proximal targets. If you haven't fixed that, you'll probably wind up back in the same place. Nonetheless, I wouldn't discourage someone from coming in with an interest in remyelination therapies. I'd be quite interested in helping that move forward, particularly if it had some corrective aspects, in the cell itself. I think there could be a real place for that. But all right, the question here about patients outside the U.S. I've gotten a few emails from people outside the U.S. who are attending the conference, and I don't know what time it is wherever all of you are outside of the U.S., but thank you for joining. I think all of us have cared for patients coming from outside the U.S. Any comments on how people can get access to trials or treatments, or participate or bring in their local doctors? Any comments there?
And so maybe I'll just kick it off by saying that we in our gene therapy trial in boys, we've included patients from around the world. And I think both Troy and I have seen patients from outside the US. I think a third of our patients are actually come from Latin America and South America. So we welcome contact with other parts of the world. We also emphasize that good care is often local care. So we don't want to be seen as expert sites that are being relied on alone. Particularly endocrinologists, I think, need to be close to home and not be sought for in an expert center, because you have to treat quickly and effectively. So I would say, while you seek advice from people in the US, also let's try to build centers of excellence across the world and empower physicians and providers who are often very good in seeking new knowledge. So there are also many advocacy organizations outside of the US that we work together with, particularly in Europe and in South America.
And Australia too, Bob Wyborn.
Yes, Bob, sure.
Yep. Yeah, I think it's there. I think we are making more and more contacts with people outside the U.S. and that's I know this is one of the things we have on our agenda as an ALD community too, is to try and bring in more representation from around the world, so we can help kind of spread a good standard of care. For now, industry-funded studies will sometimes support, just more generally, they'll support international participants. So for now, those are some of your bets if you're interested in investigative therapies, gene therapy trials, things like that. It's of course more complicated now with COVID, but those opportunities still do exist. Let's see here. Someone was asking about the future of bone marrow transplant therapy. I think this is one of the things that might be the most likely to change in the next 5-10 years or so. Troy, do you want to comment on? I'm thinking of conditioning regimens in particular, but there may be other kind of broader areas that bone marrow transplant might change in the next decade. Do you want to comment on how transplant now might differ from transplant in 10 years?
Well, we're hopefully going to get away from the toxicity of conditioning. So, antibodies are now being tested to clear out the marrow niche instead of using busulfan. Whether that's appropriate in the diseases we treat that affect the brain is unknown. But trying to use more targeted doses of chemotherapy. We used to use one dose for everybody. Well, that didn't work so well. Once we targeted the dosing, the side effects diminished. So, and then there's the cell product that's being manipulated now by a variety of mechanisms, lentiviral transfer and other viruses and CRISPR technologies coming along. So over the next decade, things will likely change. Like I always tell people, I'm trying to put myself out of business, whether it's developing a non-transplant drug package, which I think should be everybody's goal, is getting this disease into remission without having to go through a transplant. So hopefully in the next decade, we'll all be able to contribute and accomplish this.
There was a question about planandrin, which is a modified release hydrocortisone that I'm not sure if it's EU approved. It's only, the studies that I'm aware of are primarily in adults. I think that there's a very small pilot that was done in children, like maybe like a safety trial that was done in children that was published, but I have no idea about whether or not it's going through FDA, what the plans are for the FDA in the US. and mostly because I live in the pediatric world, and it certainly would be something that would go through adults here in the US before moving on to children. The primary concern would be related to growth from having long-acting hydrocortisone.
Do you think there's value to mimicking the circadian rhythm, Molly?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that a lot of the side effects that we see long-term, like weight gain, are often related to needing to give a dose later in the day when it then gives an abnormal spike in cortisol that you wouldn't normally be getting. So I think that anytime we can mimic what the body's doing in a better way, it's going to be better overall for side effects long term. But so I think that it's promising, but I think that the bigger issue in the pediatric world would be how it affects the growth plates, because it's hard to argue using it if it's going to impact how kids grow.
One we'll note there's a comment in here from a woman in the UK who has adrenal insufficiency, and asking if women should be checked regularly for this. And to comment to that, the experience is generally we can make very broad statements about what is likely to happen, and there are sometimes exceptions. To the person who's experiencing adrenal insufficiency, the woman in the UK. I don't know, Molly, is this somebody you would be interested in being in contact with to discuss further, or
I do think it's
worth getting additional genetic testing done to make sure?
Yeah, I think it's worth it. And I mean, it's interesting. Whenever I go to a conference, I feel like I say fewer than 1% of women have adrenal insufficiency because that's what's published everywhere. But if you look in the literature, there's really no published data to support that. And I think it's really important to have natural history studies to be able to firmly say that. I think it's all based on experience of very knowledgeable clinicians that they really haven't seen it. But certainly I've at these meetings have had more than one woman come up to me. I've had clinicians also say that they have females with adrenal insufficiency, whether it's ALD related or another cause, though, you would need to rule out other causes, I think.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So yeah, I'll echo what Molly said. So I've had less than a handful of women over the years with adrenal insufficiency, and I would say that the two categories they fall into is one, it's unrelated to ALD in cases of panhypopituitarism or otherwise, and then there's the other category of the very rare occurrence of carrying two copies of ABCD1 or a mutation and deletion, in which case you can also manifest like a man, and that does happen very, very rarely, and so it's not something that should be guiding routine practice. I always get an ACTH when I see a new woman with ALD just to rule it out, but I see no need to continue to monitor that. I hope Molly thinks that's okay.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, my experience, it's a limited experience, but I think this comes up with newborn screening a lot too, because we identify these babies and then you say, well, should they get tested? How often, and generally speaking, we've been saying no as an endocrine community, but if a natural history study comes out and says 5% or 3%, then get it as young adults, then maybe we need to rethink recommendations. But as of right now, I would say not to routinely monitor, but be aware of symptoms. And if you have symptoms, get tested.
I think we're about out of time here. So our next session, well, I'll take one more. I'm going to do one more question here, but our next session is kind of a social hour, and it's going to be led by a really fun member of our community, John Cruder. And so I highly encourage attending. It'll be, I think, pretty funny. The last question that I wanted to address is there's a question about chronic pain. For patients in your clinics who are experiencing chronic pain, where do you start with the process of evaluation and treatment, because there can be many, many clauses here, some of which may not be ALD related, and others may be. And when do you invoke the care of a pain specialist?
Yeah, good question. I think as neurologists, we tend to want to localize where a symptom comes from. So understanding whether the pain localizes to one particular part of the nervous system. And, you know, we often we'll think about peripheral nerve pain, but there can also be pain related to lesions in the brain. And so having a careful neurologic exam before you decide how to treat and what to treat is key. And what we do see in adults with AMN or women with ALD, it's very different in terms of pain symptomatology than in cerebral ALD. So I think that's important to keep in mind. We go to pain specialists once we have exhausted maybe one or two treatment approaches. But generally it's good to understand the root cause of the pain before you try to simply add on one medication after the other, which can have long-term consequences, particularly if you're thinking about narcotics.
We could probably expand on that for a little bit, but I think we're out of time. That was thanks for that answer, Florian. I think that's very helpful. So we'll end the session here, and then we'll move on to our social hour.